This season, Instacart has your back to school. As in, they've got your back to school lunch favorites, like snack packs and fresh fruit. And they've got your back to school supplies, like backpacks, binders, and pencils. And they've got your back when your kid casually tells you they have a huge school project due tomorrow. Let's face it, we were all that kid. So first call your parents to say I'm sorry, and then download the Instacart app to get delivery in as fast as 30 minutes all school year long. Get a $0 delivery fee for your first 3 orders while supplies last. Minimum $10 per order. Additional terms apply.
Hello and welcome to the Al-Monitor Brief. It's April 15th. I'm Kristen Tallman. We're back after a short break and a jam-packed weekend. For anyone watching the Middle East closely this weekend, tensions were at a fever pitch high as Iran launched a missile and drone attack on Israel. Our main story is a conversation with Al-Monitor's Jared Zuba and Adam Lucente, who covered the strikes over the weekend and subsequent reactions. But first, let's get you caught up on the headlines. Israel and Iran accused one another Sunday at the United Nations of being the main threat to peace in the Middle East, each calling on the Security Council to impose sanctions on their sworn enemy. French President Emmanuel Macron said Monday that France would help do everything to avoid an escalation in the Middle East after the unprecedented Iranian missile and drone attack on Israel. And while all eyes have been on the Israel-Iran spat, Israel struck war-battered Gaza overnight, Hamas and witnesses said Monday, as world leaders urged de-escalation, awaiting Israel's reaction to Iran's unprecedented attack. Commercial flights across the Middle East on Monday remained severely disrupted after Iran launched its attack, leading to several countries in the region temporarily closing their airspace. And Sudan marks on Monday 1 year since the devastating civil conflict erupted, triggering a humanitarian crisis that United Nations agencies and rights groups say is being ignored amid the world's attention focused on the war in the Gaza Strip and the ensuing tensions in the Middle East. Now, onto our main story. So, welcome to the Al-Monitor Brief, Jared and Adam. For our listeners, Jared Zuba and Adam Lucente are 2 journalists, correspondents at Al-Monitor who, over the past 24 hours, have been tracking as tensions in the Middle East have reached an all-time high. Jared, let's go over to you first. You're the Pentagon correspondent at Al-Monitor. You've been tracking much of the military response and Iran's actions. Can you walk us through what the last 24 hours have looked like, what the attack has been thus far?
Sure. Yeah, sort of walking backwards. So Iran and its proxies in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen fired more than 300 ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones, largely consisting of drones, one-way attack drones, which are manufactured and designed indigenously by the Iranian government, towards Israel in retaliation for an April 1st Israeli airstrike on the Iranian consulate complex in Damascus. Now, that Israeli strike targeted 7 IRGC Quds Force officials, including the top Quds Force commander for the whole Levant region. Now, we'd have to go a little bit further back than just the last 24 hours than this, but Iran, through the Quds Force and the IRGC and through regional proxy militias, which it supports in the countries I mentioned previously, has been essentially building up an array of ballistic missiles, drones, which can potentially overwhelm U.S. Gulf state and Israeli air defenses. And it's been doing this to gain leverage over the U.S. and its partners and allies in the region in this sort of decades-long quiet contest with the United States and Israel. And so the Israeli strike in Damascus really set this off. Iranian officials threatened to retaliate, including the Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei. And it happened. And it was, in terms of the volume of the weaponry that was used, it was larger than U.S. officials, or on the larger end of what U.S. officials were expecting. But I think the defense against this attack was, the evidence bears out, overwhelmingly successful. U.S. officials are touting their contribution. Though the Israelis did knock out the majority of the weaponry, there was some damage to an Israeli airbase in the country's south. The U.S. Air Force, 2 squadrons of U.S. Air Force F-15E fighters, knocked out more than 70 drones. 2 U.S. Navy destroyers destroyed some ballistic missiles, but the Iranians fired more than 100 ballistic missiles. I think the U.S. destroyers destroyed between 4 and 6. According to senior administration officials. The Israelis' own air missile defense systems, Arrow 2 and Arrow 3, knocked out the vast majority of the other more than 100 ballistic missiles fired by the Iranians and their proxies. So unprecedented attack, and the first attack launched from Iranian territory towards Israel in history, despite decades of animosity between those two countries. So we'll have to see where this goes next, but that's where we stand now.
And I mean, this strike from Iran was expected, or some sort of retaliation, I should say, rather, after the April 1st strike from Israeli forces on the Iranian consulate in Syria. I guess my question for you was, it seemed like this could be really catastrophic, but then it turned out to be quite a success in deterring these missiles.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think anybody in the region, other than perhaps the Iranians and their proxies, wanted this to cause any significant damage. Nobody wins in a war between Israel and Iran, especially not one that drags into the United States and potentially its Gulf partners. That's something that Biden administration officials is at the absolute top of their concerns and their worries and fears made ever since this October 7th war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. So it looks for now as if the real danger has been averted, but Israel has vowed to retaliate. Israel's former defense minister today, a member of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's security cabinet, he warned today that there would be a response. So American officials have ruled out, the Biden administration has ruled out supporting any Israeli response. This was communicated directly by President Biden to Prime Minister Netanyahu last night in a late night phone call. The Biden administration does not want to see this escalate into a regional conflict, and certainly not one that pulls in its own forces or other countries. It's not clear what action the Israelis might take, but they have significantly less freedom of action to retaliate against Iranian territory directly if they choose to do so, if the Americans sit this one out. The Israeli Air Force has some limitations in its range and how far it can go. And if there's no indication that the United States is going to support them in attacking Iranian territory directly in response to this.
Okay. Over to you, Adam. You've been tracking the regional responses from Arab states and the perception from Iranian actors. Can you give us some insight into the thoughts and responses there?
Yeah, so in the region, the reactions by governments have been somewhat mixed. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, they all called for de-escalation, and they expressed concern about the general situation after the Iranian attack. Saudi Arabia obviously is a strategic rival of sorts with Iran, despite resuming relations last year. Egypt and Jordan responded a little differently. Egypt's foreign ministry warned of the dangers of the expansion of the Gaza war, and Jordan's foreign minister said that the Gaza war must stop for the de-escalation to occur. So those governments have been tying the de-escalation explicitly to the Gaza war and their efforts to get the war to stop with a ceasefire. Jordan, of course, is also dealing with regular protests against Israel in Amman. And Jordan was actually criticized in Iranian media for acting against some of the overhead objects in Jordanian airspace, which is interesting. On Turkey, the foreign minister, Fidan, he held a call with his Iranian counterpart, Amir Abdullahian, after the attack. Turkey called for restraint, but the Turkish foreign ministry also had a statement criticizing the alleged Israeli strike on the Iranian consulate. So basically, the regional governments have been calling for de-escalation, but in somewhat different ways.
And Adam, you talked to the reactions across countries in the region, but what about specifically the reaction from Tehran?
So Iranian leaders and officials the day after have been kind of bragging about what happened, presenting it as a success. President Raisi said it was a new page in history and that Iran taught a lesson to Israel. The IRGC commander-in-chief, Hossein Salami, he gave an interview saying that from now on, Iran will not hesitate to attack from within Iran if Israel hits any of its personnel or property, and that could, obviously apply to Syria. And he also said that the attack could have been much larger. On the diplomatic front, the foreign minister, Amir Abdullahian, he said that there are no plans for further strikes, but he did say that Iran will respond to aggression in the future. So that leaves the door open for, potentially more actions down the road.
So I think it's important to note that, while no countries in the region, except as mentioned, Iran and its proxies probably wanted to see any significant damage and thus a regional war come out of this. It's important to note that Arab states in the Persian Gulf region where U.S. forces are based are under significant threat from Iran, and Iran publicly threatened countries ahead of this attack not to get involved in Israel's self-defense. And they did anyway. So Jordan defended its own airspace from projectile drones coming through in direct coordination with the U.S. military. The French government, British, and a few other regional states also coordinated with the U.S. on this defense. The Israelis coordinated directly with the British and the French. And so what you had was a sort of pretty what appears to be a pretty successful stress test of this nascent regional air defense coalition that the United States has been trying to build up, not just during the Biden administration, but dating way back to the Obama administration and even prior to the Bush administration, with efforts to build a sort of regional air defense and missile defense network in the Persian Gulf region. So I think it's important to keep in mind that there are sort of public reactions, but then you also have sort of behind the scenes coordination to defend the airspace of these countries and create a sort of buffer, a multi-layered umbrella around Israel, which isn't perfect yet and clearly involves a lot of air-to-air shoot downs, which is not the ideal way to deal with these weapons. But as technology advances and as the U.S. and its partners, the U.S. convinces its partners in the region to sort of increasingly work together on sharing air defense data and scrambling fighters to defend each other's territory, I think it's pretty historically significant that Saudi Arabia and Iraq, U.S. has the permission to use their airspace to defend an Iranian attack against Israel. So American officials are touting this as a real success, even if it's not out in the open, the extent to which Israel's neighbors gave a green light for the U.S. to help defend.
So just to be clear, what you're saying is it's not like Saudi Arabia and Jordan in their statements are necessarily touting that they worked in partnership, but this is something that was done behind the scenes and is a show of just how quickly partners were able to come together.
Yes, and of course it's unclear, and it probably won't be clear for a while, if ever, the extent to which some Arab states around Israel actually either supported tacitly or even directly. I mean, we do know, Reuters reported that Royal Jordanian Air Force pilots were up there shooting down drones. Jordan has worked with Israel in the past on early warning air defense systems. We've reported that, and others have reported that. What's less clear is the extent to which Saudi Arabia, for example, was involved in this effort, though American KC-135, I believe it was 135 Stratotankers were clearly airborne over Saudi airspace, probably refueling American fighter jets, possibly even, French and British, but can't confirm. I would have to leave it to the realm of speculation at this time, because Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia, which U.S. officials say remains interested in normalizing ties with Israel, but Saudi Arabia still remains under significant threat from Iran's drone and missile arsenal. And this is not something Gulf states are keen to get in the middle of, at least visibly.
The last thing that I have for both of you, and maybe I'll give you a moment for each of you to respond, is what should we be looking for in the coming days, in the coming hours? Is it sort of all wrapped up and done? It appears to be that way from statements on both from Iranian officials and from U.S., with Biden telling Israel, don't overreact to this. It's been a success. Let's move on past these 24 hours. But what should we be looking out for and what's to come? Here, let's start with you, Adam.
Okay. So obviously the Israeli response, what they do, will determine how this goes, as well as the U.S. reaction before, during, and after. But a few things to look at. I think one is that Jordan is in a difficult position. The Jordanian government's cabinet, in their statement, said that the military acted to defend civilians against flying objects over the Jordanian airspace. But the king needs to weigh, strong anti-Israel sentiment in the country versus Jordan's very important relationship with the U.S. and also the risks of a regional war. Another thing to look out is for the Iraqi militias. On their channels, they obviously celebrated the Iranian attack. And we saw earlier this year the risks that these militias can pose in a strike they claimed that killed 3 U.S. forces. And as always, Lebanon is another space to watch. Some people expect a bigger war between Hezbollah and Israel eventually, perhaps after what wraps up in Gaza. And Hezbollah notably struck Israel the day before the Iranian attack. And this is part of, cross-border fire back and forth for weeks. And tensions in Lebanon are particularly high right now after a member of a Christian group, Lebanese forces, a member was found dead. So these are some spaces to watch.
Jared, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think all eyes are on Prime Minister Netanyahu and his cabinet. The Iranians signaled both publicly and privately via the Swiss embassy to the Americans last night, while the attack was actually still going on after they had fired these projectiles from Iranian territory. They sent a message saying that that's it. The attack is done. We consider the matter over with, and they will defend themselves against any retaliatory attack to the current attack. The fact that the Iranians sent this message while the attack was still going on shows you, I think, how eager Tehran is to, one, perform a sort of spectacular show of force, at least in this retaliation, send a signal and redraw the lines in its rules of engagement with Israel in the sort of back and forth covert conflict, but two, to get this over and done with in hopefully a way that doesn't start a major conflict. So I don't think Hezbollah and Iran are interested in continuing this. However, you did see the head of the the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Hossein Salameh, say that the sort of rules of engagement with Israel have been redrawn, and that further attacks on Iran's interests, leaving that open to interpretation, will involve a firm Iranian response. So it does seem that Israel's campaign of quiet airstrikes against IRGC officials in Syria and elsewhere is not going to be tolerated by Iran any longer. But it is quite clear, I think, from the U.S. and Israeli intelligence that neither Hezbollah nor Iran are desiring an all-out war in the region, though they are willing to risk it to reestablish deterrence.
Okay. Thank you so much, both of you, and great reporting over the last 24 hours. That's it for today, April 15th. You can read more details on all these stories and other ones impacting the region at allmonitor.com.